It's the 27th of June 1790 on the shores of Port Jackson in the fledgling colony of New South Wales. Governor Arthur Phillip has come to meet the Neptune, the second convict ship from the group of 5 known as the Second Fleet to arrive in the colony in 2 days. And he is not a happy man. It's not that he doesn't want the convicts to land. He knew when he accepted the post of Governor of New South Wales that he was effectively accepting a demotion from British Navy captain to superintendent of the world's largest open-air prison, at least from a European perspective. But he's furious about the condition the convicts are in. It would appear that the Neptune has had a rough voyage, if their condition is anything to go by, but Phillip is more interested in the crew, who seem perfectly healthy despite the long voyage and the appalling state of their charges. Nearly every convict on board the ship is dying of starvation, scurvy, cholera, dysentery, or any combination of the above, and the men have deep sores on their legs. Phillip can see the bones in some cases, because they've been kept in chains for the entirety of the journey. Most are too sick to even get up when they land, and the crew literally heave them over the side like sacks of flour until Phillip himself puts a stop to it and organises for the convicts to be carried off the ship and taken to the rudimentary tent hospital. The few who can walk try to help carry their fellows, although most can't make it more than a few steps before they're exhausted. As for the convict women who've landed over the last 2 days, all are either pregnant or have very young babies with them who were clearly born at sea, and somehow none of the crew on any of the ships, there's been 3 arrive in the last month, knows anything about that. But it's the extremely poor health of the male convicts from the Neptune that concerns Phillip most. New South Wales does not have the facilities to care for such a large number of dangerously ill people, and the governor is further appalled to discover that, of the total of 1,006 convicts who were taken on board the ships of the Second Fleet in Britain, 273 died on the voyage. A further 486 of these convicts have landed sick, and around 40% of them will die within a week of arriving in the colony. To make matters worse, New South Wales is in the grip of a famine. The colony is not yet self-sufficient, although this is not for lack of trying by Phillip, and it relies on supplies from Britain to feed and clothe the people who live there. There are supplies on the Neptune. In fact, there are far, far more supplies than there should be, and a wrathful Phillip is forced to buy them at massively marked up rates from the shameless captain, a man named Donald Trail. Phillip is so angry that Trail is lucky not to be arrested, and he sails away from the famine-stricken colony, having made his company approximately £17,102 for delivering a boatload of sick, dying and starving convicts. When the 4th ship, the Scarborough, lands the following day and the convicts are only in slightly better condition, Phillip is absolutely ropeable. It is fortunate for the Scarborough's captain, a man named John Marshall, that he has supplies that already belong to the colony that Phillip doesn't have to buy, because the governor makes it quite clear that he's not paying a penny above market value for anything on board the ship, and Marshall quickly clears off back to England before the furious governor gets it in his mind to hang him. Phillip's fury leads him to write to the colonial secretary in London about the condition of the convicts, especially the men on the Neptune, and demand changes to the way transportation is handled. When news reaches London regarding what happened on these ships, the public is appalled. It's true that many of them see the convicts as elements of a criminal underclass, but the large and vocal emancipation movement, slavery still being legal in Britain and the British Empire, has also taken up the cause of these people, and most of the public don't like the idea of British people, their people, even if they are criminals, being treated like slaves. It's one thing to forcibly transport them to Australia, but another to starve them, chain them up, and then dump them in a famine-stricken colony. But what happened on board those ships of the Second Fleet that things went so wrong? The First Fleet had sailed in very similar conditions with roughly the same number of people and had seen only 24 deaths, and just 30 people had been ill when the ships landed. So was it just bad luck? Or something more sinister? I'm Juliana, and you're listening to The Skeptical Historian. Hello skeptics, and welcome back to another episode, and thank you so very, very much as always for joining me. I'm going to begin today by acknowledging that I am podcasting on the sovereign and unceded land of the Wurundjeri, Wurrung and Boonwurrung people, and I recognise their timeless history-making and deep connection to the lands, waters and stories of this nation, and would also like to pay my respects to their elders. Shout out also to Studio 4 at the State Library of Victoria, where this episode is being recorded. For more information or to book the studio yourself, please head to www.slv.vic.gov.au. That's www.slv.vic.gov.au. Also, just a quick warning, I'm going to be talking about some unpleasant and controversial topics today, including abuse, torture, and slavery. So listener discretion is advised, and this episode may not be appropriate for young listeners. But before we do that, let's set the scene. The colony of New South Wales in 1790. The British had only arrived on the land of the Eora people 2 years ago, and their settlement was little more than tents and a few flimsy wooden buildings. Work had been ongoing to clear the land and build the city Governor Arthur Phillip imagined, but it was slow and made even slower by the fact that the whole thing was an experiment anyway. Australia might as well have been the moon to the British in 1788 when the first fleet landed, and most people in Britain still had no real idea where it was or how far away it was by 1790. To make matters worse, Governor Arthur Phillip and Major Ross, Major Ross being the commander of the British Marine Corps in the colony and the Lieutenant Governor of New South Wales, absolutely detested each other. To be more specific, Ross hated Phillip, who he viewed as a soft-hearted idealist, while Phillip held Ross in absolute contempt for his constant contrary attitude and refusal to help the governor realise his ambitions for the colony. Ross was also quite partial to complaining that he did not receive the respect due to him as the lieutenant governor, and seems to have enjoyed making trouble for trouble's sake. Case in point, Ross frequently complained that the Marines in the colony, who were under his command, were living in tents that were not fit for purpose and that barracks needed to be built. When Phillip's administration began work on building those barracks, Ross complained that building barracks was a waste of money and resources when they already had tents. When Phillip ignored these complaints, and he had become very good at ignoring Major Ross by 1790, Ross responded by deliberately creating friction between the convicts who were building the barracks and the Marines assigned to guard them. Phillip finally had enough of him and promoted him by sending him to Norfolk Island to establish a settlement there shortly before the Second Fleet arrived. Ross was partially successful in setting up a colony in Norfolk Island, but he was so hated by his own men, the convicts and the administrators that Phillip had sent with him, that the governor had to send another man to replace him within months to stave off a mutiny. The point of these little anecdotes? Well, as hard to establish a colony and all the administration that goes with it, as well as feed, clothe, house and guard 800 plus convicts before the arrival of the Second Fleet, when the governor and the lieutenant governor can't stand the sight of each other. The reason Phillip and Ross clashed so hard was because their visions for New South Wales were completely opposed. Phillip saw his mission in the colony as not just to be the warden of an open-air jail, but to create a thriving and self-sufficient European city with a focus on reforming the convicts. Thus, at the end of their sentences, those who had learned a trade could earn wages or start their own businesses and contribute to the economy. He wanted New South Wales to eventually grow to become a kind of Britain of the South, and until free settlers could be wooed over, the convicts needed to feel they had something to gain by contributing to their new home. Ross, on the other hand, felt the whole idea of New South Wales and penal transportation was worthless, and that the best thing to do with a criminal, any criminal, was hang them. When he failed to convince his own superiors of this, He put all his energies into opposing Philip at every turn and insisted that the purpose of the settlement was to punish the convicts, not reform them. There were major social issues occurring in the colony at this point too. There had been no free settlers on the First Fleet. It had been made up entirely of convicts, marines and administrators. Most of these men had military or government backgrounds. The convicts had to do all the heavy work establishing the colony, including clearing land and building structures. But this was hampered by the fact that many of the tools the First Fleet had brought with them were not suitable for Australian timber. It was in fact not uncommon for axes to break while trying to cut down trees in this area. There was also the fact that the Ora people strenuously objected to these strange invaders cutting down their trees, staying on their land without permission, and denying them access to their essential hunting, fishing and sacred places. Violent clashes became common, and the administration responded by sending the Marines out into the bush to deal with what they saw as violent, savage natives. But I want you to picture the absurdity of this for a moment. British Marines in vivid red jackets and bright white trousers, armed with muskets longer than their entire bodies, crashing through the green, grey and brown Australian bush in pursuit of Indigenous guerrilla warriors who could move silently, disappear at will, and work together in seamless harmony. That said, there were of course many, many horrific massacres in the early years of European settlement around and in what is now Sydney. Once it became apparent that trying to follow the warriors into the bush was pointless, the Marines started doing things like sneaking up on campsites at night and driving everyone they could find, man, woman or child, off cliffs and into the sea. Now this brutality would spread all across Australia as Europeans continued to settle on the continent, and I'd highly recommend the Australian Wars on SBS if you would like more information. Among the British population, there was also friction, especially between the Marines and the convicts they were guarding, although not for the reasons that might initially be apparent. In popular Australian history, British military personnel in this period, whatever service they're from, be it Army, Navy or Marines, are usually portrayed as stupid and sadistic. Some of them were. In every organisation that ever has and will ever exist, there will be people within it who are stupid and sadistic. But, as I discussed in several episodes last season, most regular men joined the military because it offered stable wages and guaranteed food, shelter, clothing, accommodation and medical care. Conditions in the Army, Navy and Marines were appalling for regular men right up into the end of the 19th century, and this was very well known by the working poor who filled their ranks. But it was often better than the lives they had left behind. The minimum service period for a soldier, sailor or marine in the 18th century was 21 years, and military personnel lived lives of extreme hardship and boredom. At the end of their service, they could enlist for another 12 years, or they could accept their discharge and go back to England with no pension, few skills that were transferable to civilian life, and no support from the organisation they'd devoted most of their life to. Under such circumstances, it's hardly surprising most former military personnel turned to alcohol and eventually died destitute. The conflict the Marines had with the convicts in New South Wales came from the realisation that these men, these criminals, had more rights and better conditions than the Marines did. They did the same type of heavy work the Marines had to do, and while they weren't paid for it, they also didn't have to pay for their clothes or their rations, and when they had served half their sentence, which was either 3.5 years or 7 years for most of them, they were eligible for a ticket of leave and they could apply for a land grant and settle in the colony. And once they had their ticket of leave, they could earn wages, employ labourers, or even start their own businesses if they had the skills to do so. The Marines were earning 1 shilling per day, with almost a quarter of that immediately disappearing to pay for their rations, and somehow had to keep up a uniform worth approximately £12 on that meagre salary. They would never be given land or have the opportunity to own farms and run businesses. In fact, some Marines were so incensed by this that they deliberately committed crimes while in Australia that they knew would get them discharged and transported That is, they would become convicts because that life was easier than the one they were leading. Also, remember earlier how I told you about Major Ross and all the problems he was causing? He ordered his subordinate officers to refuse to guard convicts, and some of them also gave these orders to the NCOs and the regular men. To solve this issue, Philip, or more likely his administrators, appointed well-behaved convicts as overseers, something which infuriated the Marines even further because the overseers received a payment for guarding their fellows. In fact, things got so ugly it looked as if there would be a mutiny, but the soldiers blamed Ross, not Philip, for the situation. He, after all, had given the order. In this way, Ross's meddling backfired and he quickly, albeit reluctantly, rescinded the order, although the system of overseers worked so well that Philip implemented it across the board. The Marines still undertook the actual guard duty and were responsible for ensuring the convicts didn't escape, while the overseers ensured that work was done to the appropriate standard. The Marines didn't get any extra payment for undertaking guard duty, but it did stave off serious violence between them and the convicts. And then there was the economy. New South Wales was not only in the midst of a famine. It had no structured economy to speak of, and the preferred currency was rum. Philip had tried to introduce monetary currency, but he hadn't bought enough of it and it had just caused further problems. Most people preferred to barter, and even soldiers and sailors received their wages as a measure of rum, and you can imagine how that turned out. Really, at this point, European New South Wales was a giant campsite occupied by inept campers who had no idea how to exist outside the confines of a European-style city or town. They fumbled along as best they could, but Philip was painfully aware that the colony needed to become self-sufficient quickly and could not rely much longer on being supplied by Britain. He also knew that some kind of formal economy was needed and that paying everybody in rum was only going to make a bad situation worse. And then there was that famine I keep talking about. Farms had been set up, but few of them had been able to produce enough crops to feed the population, and the farmers were still getting used to Australian conditions. Rations were tight, and this was causing tension for a rather unusual reason. In times of plenty, when there was more than enough to go around, Governor Arthur Phillip agreed that class was very important. But when lean times struck, he refused to allow high-ranking colonial officials extra or better rations than anybody else had. Everybody, and I do literally mean everybody, from the lowest convict all the way up to Philip himself, ate the same amount of the same thing. This was felt to be scandalous by those officials who believed, by virtue of their birth, they were better than everyone else and, as such, deserved better food. But Philip would not be swayed. Until the colony had enough food, everyone ate what were effectively army rations. Now, Philip and his officials knew that the Second Fleet would be bringing supplies, but it didn't happen in the manner Philip imagined, and there's a particular reason for that. It is often said that the reason things went so badly on the Second Fleet compared to the First is because the Second Fleet was run by private contractors, where the First was done entirely at government expense. But this is not quite true. The First Fleet was managed by a private contractor, a man named William Richards, and the terms of his contract were very different to those of the contract awarded to the shipping company Camden, Calvert and King, who managed the Second Fleet. The British government had known perfectly well that establishing a penal colony on the other side of the world was going to be expensive, but they didn't know just how expensive, and they also knew it was going to be a hugely risky enterprise. The contract for the First Fleet was eventually awarded to Richards on a costs-plus basis, and he took the assignment very seriously. He spent time hiring the best ships from reputable companies. He ensured they were stocked with quality provisions and that conditions below deck were livable for the convicts. Richards had several motivations for doing well. There was obvious economic benefit. If it worked, he would be paid very well for it after all. But he also hoped that if he did a good job, he'd get future government contracts in this area. Convict transportation to New South Wales was brand new, and it was looking like it could be lucrative. Finally, Richards was a humanitarian, an abolitionist, and an advocate for prison management contracts based on proper care and humanity. This was also a time when private prison management was becoming a thing. He was also a very religious man who believed that Christianity, above all else, was about helping the less fortunate. Although, like most charity-minded men of his time, he was paternalistic and believed that he knew what the less fortunate needed without having to ask them what that was. The other difference between the first and second fleets was the presence of Governor Arthur Phillip. Like Richards, Phillip was a dedicated humanitarian, and he wanted the penal colony to work. It would not only be good for his career if it did, but it would also reduce overcrowding in prisons, an area many humanitarians of the 1790s took a keen interest in, and would give prisoners a chance to better themselves through hard yet meaningful work. Phillip was as paternalistic as any other man of his class and time, but it can honestly be said that he had the convicts' best interests at heart. On a purely practical level, Phillip needed these people alive and healthy when they reached New South Wales, because they were going to be the ones doing all the work, setting up the colony, and then assisting to keep it running afterwards. Phillip personally inspected the supplies Richards had provided and refused to allow the fleet to depart until there were adequate provisions for everyone on board. The first fleet stopped 3 times on the journey to Australia, and the convicts were allowed up on deck and to move around during the voyage as well. Phillip himself personally oversaw the treatment of these men, and a few women, and ensured that most of them arrived safe and well in New South Wales. One would think then that this voyage would have been considered a success, and from the perspective of Phillip and Richards, it certainly was. However, the cost for the first fleet came in at somewhere between $55,000 and £89,000. According to an article published by the Australia and New Zealand School of Government in 2017, that was the equivalent of 110 million Australian dollars. Keep in mind that one of the purposes of transportation was to save the British government money, as it would no longer have to bear the cost of feeding, housing and clothing people held in their prisons. The Treasury went into absolute meltdown over the cost of the first fleet, and William Richards, despite his excellent work, never received another transportation contract. The British government now also had to contend with what to do about supplying the colony, as New South Wales was not self-sufficient and there was opposition in some corners of Parliament about it ever being allowed to be so. It was, some MPs argued, a prison, and if it became self-sufficient, some people might want to go there, which would entirely defeat the purpose of its existence in the first place. One particularly nasty MP declared that he wanted New South Wales to be such a fearsome spectre that the prisoners sentenced to transportation would instead beg for the gallows. But supplying a penal colony on the other side of the world would be expensive, and the massive cost of the first fleet had some in Parliament wondering if the whole transportation experiment was worth it anyway. The prisons were still overcrowded, crime was still rampant, and it would be easier, not to mention cheaper, to just go back to hangings. Parliament eventually decided to continue transportation, but decided that the contract for the second fleet would be awarded to the company which offered the lowest price. Enter Camden, Calvert and King, a former slave shipping company who had decided to enter the transportation market in the hope of a lucrative new opportunity which would attract less trouble. While slavery was still legal in Britain and the British Empire in 1790, the abolitionist movement was loud and it was strong. There was not yet enough support in Parliament to abolish the heinous practice, but it was fast falling out of favour with the British public as they learned more and more about the realities for enslaved people forced to live and work on colonial plantations. Camden, Calvert and King were savvy enough to realise that slaving was not going to pay for much longer, and that convict transportation had the potential to be a much more lucrative market. To reduce the cost and encourage shipping companies to bid on the tender, the British government introduced a flat fee model. The shipping company would be paid a flat rate for every convict who boarded the ship, regardless of whether they made it to New South Wales or not, or what condition they were in when they got there. This reduced the risk for the shipping companies and made them more likely to bid on the tender. To make the long voyage to New South Wales more appealing for the ship's crew, the government also added a provision to the contract that any surplus supplies could be sold by the ship's crew on arrival in New South Wales. Rather like a tip at a restaurant today, any money from selling the surplus supplies went straight into the pockets of the crew members, not to the company. It was seen as compensation for making such a long and difficult journey, but the catch was the supplies had to be surplus. The convicts still had to be fed, clothed and cared for. The problem was that the people employed by Camden, Calvert and King did not care a lick about their charges. As far as they were concerned, the convicts were cargo that they were being paid to transport, and the more money they could make out of the arrangement, the better it was for them. And so began the hellish journey for the men and women of the Second Fleet. Those on the Neptune had it particularly bad. Captain Donald Trail, who, like all of Camden, Calvert and King's captains, had previously commanded slave ships, was known for his cruelty, and his interest was purely in how much money he could make from the whole exercise. Unless he had surplus supplies to sell in New South Wales, he wasn't going to make anything apart from his wages, so he ensured there would be a surplus by deliberately withholding food from the convicts. As one military officer on board the Neptune wrote, "The more they can withhold from the unhappy wretches, the more provisions they have to dispose of on a foreign market, and the earlier in the voyage they die, the longer they can draw on the deceased's allowance for themselves. I fear few of them are honest enough to make a just return of the dates of their deaths to their employers." Translation? Trail was starving the convicts so he and his crew could sell their food at a profit on the other side of the world. The less convicts who survived, the more surplus he had to sell. Now, there was a contract monitor travelling with the Second Fleet, whose job it was to try and prevent this very thing from happening, but he was a junior public official described by one historian as an ineffectual hack of questionable competence who spent most of the journey being wined and dined by Trail rather than monitoring the welfare of the convicts. The surgeon on board the Neptune appears to be one of the few men who took his job seriously. He continually raised concerns about the quality and quantity of food being served to prisoners, as well as other issues with their conditions which were killing them, but he was completely ignored by Trail. The surgeon could do very little, but he had plenty to say to Governor Phillip when they landed in New South Wales. Most disturbingly, he reported that some of the starving men on the Neptune had taken to eating poultices placed on the wounds on their legs, most of which were made of oatmeal, in a desperate attempt to survive. While not every captain of the Second Fleet was as heartless as Trail, none of them spared a thought for the welfare of the convicts. This was partly because they were former slavers who were vile to begin with. And no, that is not me projecting 2025 ideas back onto the people of 1790. To be a sailor on a slave ship, let alone the commanding officer, you needed to have a strong stomach and a sadistic streak a mile wide. But this lack of care also partly came about because of another badly thought out provision in the contracts these men were working under. If you think back to the immersion at the beginning of the podcast, you might remember that most of the convict men on board the Neptune arrived with sores on their legs. In some cases, these were so extreme that the bones of their legs were visible beneath the shackles, and many of them had awful infections. This was also the case on 2 other ships as well. There were 6 in total, and it didn't just come down to casual cruelty. The contracts which enriched the captain and crew also personally penalised them for any escapes. Camden, Calvert and King had been paid £17, 7 shillings and 6 pence per convict who boarded in England. To put this in perspective, the average labourer in England in 1790 earned an annual salary of approximately 13 shillings. So this payment was equivalent to around 11 years' wages for an ordinary working man. Of course, the sailors themselves were not getting this payment, it went to the company, but it was the sailors who'd have to pay it back if any of the convicts escaped. The majority of them were working men. Sailors' wages would have been roughly the same as army wages, around $1 a day. So £17 was money they did not have. The reality was that few convicts ever tried to escape, purely because there was nowhere for them to escape to. Escapes generally were rare in colonial Australia, and those convicts who did flee often returned very quickly, despite knowing harsh punishment awaited them, because the alternative was starving to death and dying alone. As for escapes on ships, this was completely unheard of. But the perverse incentive created by this clause meant that the sailors took steps to ensure there was zero chance of them ever having to find £17 to pay for an escaped convict. They kept the convicts locked up below deck for the entire journey. Some of them went even further and used leg irons common in the slave trade, which were designed to break the victim's legs if they moved while wearing them. Female convicts on the Second Fleet had fared better in some senses. They were not chained up below deck, but they were very vulnerable to sexual assault, and most arrived in the colony heavily pregnant or with very young babies. Now, it's worth taking a moment to examine this. Really, it could be its own podcast, but for now it's worth having a surface overview. First of all, any sex act between convict women and the men on the ships, be they sailors or soldiers, was rape by definition. This isn't a case of projecting modern laws back into the past either. It was as illegal in 1790 as it would be in 2025. These women were prisoners and the men on the ships were their guards, meaning the power imbalance alone made consensual sex impossible. Having said this, it is important not to diminish the agency of convict women in these situations. Accepting the attentions of a soldier or sailor often meant better food and conditions, and the added benefit of having a protector in what could be a very violent and dangerous environment. This is not to say that violent rape never occurred on these ships, or that all the sex was transactional, but it would also be wrong to say that every convict woman preyed on by soldiers and sailors during the voyage to Australia was a helpless victim. We can recognise that rape was prolific on these ships, while also acknowledging the agency of the women who found themselves trapped on board. Accepting the advances of a man, or at the very least being docile and appearing to accept his advances, not only decreased the chances of violence, but increased the chances for the woman in question to survive the journey. There were no female convicts on board the Neptune, but they had been on other ships of the Second Fleet. When Trail landed, he was more interested in speaking to Philip about buying the supplies he had with him than supervising the removal of the convicts. The sick men on board were quite literally tossed over the side like sacks of rubbish until Philip put a stop to it and organised for the convicts to be properly removed. Trail had a frustrating wait ahead of him before Philip was prepared to speak to him about buying the supplies, and it appears to be around this point that the captain realised he had taken a very dangerous gamble. Despite initially insisting that Philip immediately negotiate with him to buy the surplus, which was not surplus at all, as we have already heard, Trail quickly backed off once it became apparent that Philip was going to do things on his terms and according to his timetable. Philip did buy the supplies, and he did pay the massively marked up price that Trail insisted on, because short of ordering the Marines he had under his command to board the ship and take supplies by force, Philip had no other choice but to agree to the extortionate terms. Had Philip seized these supplies, Camden, Calvert and King would have undoubtedly complained and possibly sued for breach of contract when that news reached England. Philip could have been held personally liable for the loss made to the company had he seized the supplies, but by the time the final ship of the Second Fleet arrived, the Scarborough, which landed just a few days after the Neptune, Philip had had enough of being extorted. The Scarborough didn't have as much surplus as the Neptune because the captain of the Scarborough had fed the convicts, although not as much as he should, but his fear that they would all escape had led to them being imprisoned in shackles below deck for the entire journey. They were all incredibly sick when they arrived, and Philip made it perfectly clear that when it came to anything to sell, he wasn't paying a penny. above market value for the goods on the Scarborough, and if the captain didn't like it, he could kick gravel and travel. As it was, the Scarborough also had a delivery of goods that Philip had ordered from a supplier in South Africa. These had already been paid for, and the supplier had actually had a hard time getting the ships of the Second Fleet to take them. Trail had refused to allow the goods to be loaded onto the Neptune because he argued there was not enough room. There would have been room for the goods if Trail had been feeding the convicts properly. He also didn't want the goods on his ship because there was no benefit to him in carrying them. He couldn't sell them and he wasn't going to get any kind of payment for their delivery. The other captains made similar arguments so that by the time the Scarborough stopped in South Africa, the supplier made it clear that he wasn't asking but was informing the captain that these goods would be loaded into his hold. By the time the ships of the Second Fleet left, along with their much enriched crews, the colony was no longer at risk of starvation, although the economy was in even worse shape than before, and Philip's rage would follow these ships all the way back to England. Among the cargo that they carried home were Philip's letters, which described in detail the condition the convicts had been in when they arrived in New South Wales, and it also stated that Trail had deliberately starved the men so he could make more money selling the surplus supplies. Philip strongly recommended to the British Parliament that Trail and the company he worked for face prosecution back in England. He made similar recommendations about the other captains, although, sadly, these were never acted on. In fact, the British government had already awarded the contract for the Third Fleet to Camden, Calvert and King because they liked the low price the company was prepared to accept. However, while that fleet was being fitted out, Philip's letters arrived back in England, along with reports from other administrative officials who wrote to friends, family and humanitarian groups about what they had witnessed on board the fleet. It took months for news to get from Australia to England and vice versa at that time. But when word of what had happened to the convicts on the Second Fleet broke, there was public uproar. Transportation enjoyed broad support only because it was presented as a more humane way to deal with petty criminals than hangings. However, this support not only hinged on keeping the cost low, which Camden, Calvert and King did, but also on the convicts being relatively well cared for. Taxpayers, quite understandably, did not want to foot the bill to ship boatloads of dying men halfway around the world, only so the ship's crews could get rich by starving their charges. It's also worth noting at this time that all British men paid tax, but not all of them were eligible to vote, and the outcry over the Second Fleet was so loud it almost triggered a public inquiry due to the number of men who started making this claim. Their taxes were being misused by people they couldn't vote for, so maybe it was time for a revolution. However, the government managed to quell this sentiment, and they also managed to avoid having to call the inquiry. There was real fear among the politicians that, if the public were made aware of just how inhumane transportation really was, they would stop supporting it. A public inquiry into the Second Fleet would not only have revealed the heinous conditions on board those ships, but the horrors of transportation in general. However, in order to prevent such a thing happening again, the government did make some changes. The flat fee model was kept, and the government paid out for the convicts who boarded the ships in England. But the company would have to repay the government for any convicts who died en route or who arrived sick, injured, or otherwise unable to work, and the governor would provide an independent report to be considered alongside the report of the ship's captain. Responsibility for the convicts was also removed from the captain himself and placed in the hands of an independently appointed and paid ship surgeon, usually former Navy surgeons, who had final say in all matters regarding the health of the convicts. The stores which were used to feed the convicts were also kept separately from those of the crew, administrators, and, as immigration increased, the free settlers who began to make their way to the colony. The surgeon had control over the convict stores, and while surplus supplies could still be sold for a profit in the colony, a new recording system was put in place, and independent quartermasters were hired to ensure that any surplus really was surplus. These quartermasters reported to the surgeon, and the surgeon himself, to ensure he didn't abuse his position, received a bonus for each convict who arrived healthy and able to work in New South Wales. Provisions making companies liable for escapes were removed, and the contracts had a set number of stops built into them, and also required that convicts be allowed on deck for minimum periods of air and exercise. To reduce the chance of the surgeons being corrupted by unscrupulous ship's captains, there were also contract monitors employed by the government on all ships carrying convicts, not just one man across a whole fleet. These men were also much more experienced government officials, and they reported directly to the colonial governor and the British Parliament. They were not answerable to the captains of the ships they were travelling on or the companies that employed the crews. Now, it would be wrong to say that these new conditions made transportation humane. By its nature, transportation was inhumane. But they did remove the perverse incentives that had contributed to the horrendous conditions on the Second Fleet. Despite Camden, Calvert and King getting the tender for the Third Fleet, the changes made to the contracts meant the voyage was better, relatively speaking, than the previous one. The company was not awarded any more transportation contracts after the Third Fleet, though. The government, it seems, knew to quit while they were ahead. As mentioned, despite enormous public pressure, none of the captains or crews from the Second Fleet were ever convicted over their appalling abuse of the convicts in their care. Trail was charged, but acquitted by a jury first in criminal and then in civil court as well. However, the court cases affected his reputation, and while he continued to work as a captain for Camden, Calvert and King, he complained regularly that he felt independent observers in both Australia and then India, where he later worked, paid him unduly close attention. Given his history, I think this kind of monitoring was warranted. Transportation itself would continue to the east coast of Australia until 1853, and then limited numbers of convicts were sent to the west coast until 1868, when transportation ceased entirely. The last known person to have transported as a convict to Australia died in Perth at the age of 97 in 1938, and he had been transported in 1866. Transportation really deserves a podcast of its own, and I've certainly got one in the works, but we need to be careful how we talk about it. The First Fleet has been romanticised, and Australians love to suggest our supposed larrikin spirit and anti-authority bias comes from our convict ancestors. Actually, according to international statistics, Australians are among the most law-abiding people in the world. But most of these people, these convicts that we like to look back on as the original larrikins, were not the dashing daredevils of Australian mythology. They were petty criminals. They were low-level foot soldiers in organised crime gangs. They were the hungry poor and political prisoners. Transportation wasn't glamorous, and perhaps the reason the Second Fleet gets so little attention compared to the First is because it illustrates the realities of this system to a grisly T. No one was ever held to account for what happened to those convicts, and the British government was well aware that transportation itself was deeply inhumane. But as long as it wasn't affecting the class they belonged to, and as long as they could mislead the general tax-paying public about the realities of the system, they were going to keep it. They literally swept Britain's social issues under the rug until the Australian colonies put their feet down and refused to take any more convicts. Then, and only then, did Britain slowly, grudgingly, and very, very reluctantly begin to reform. And skeptics, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much once again for joining me. If you're looking to get in touch, I'm easy to find online. Just search for Juliana Byers on LinkedIn and Instagram. And don't forget to have a look at my website while you're at it. It's www.skepticalhistory.com. That's skeptical with a K. And I'll see you next episode for another take on the mystery that is history. Bye now. The Skeptical Historian is researched, produced and hosted by me, Juliana Byers. You can find a full list of resources used in my research by going to my rss.com podcast page, clicking on the relevant episode, opening the transcript, and scrolling down to find the sources. That's rss.com/podcasts/the-skeptical-historian. Sound effects are by Adobe Creative Cloud, Pixabay, and Epidemic Sound, used under the appropriate license. The music track The Whistle Funk by Telsonic was also used appropriately. Podcast hosting is by rss.com. See you next time, skeptics.